Somewhere beneath the sea, an empire is said to be sleeping. Not a village, not a ruin half buried in sand. An entire civilization, rich, powerful, brilliant, and doomed, swallowed by water in a single catastrophe. For centuries, people have searched for Atlantis in oceans, islands, maps, myths, and mistakes. But the real mystery is not only where it was, it is whether Atlantis was ever a place at all. Was it a lost civilization, destroyed by disaster? A distorted memory of something ancient and terrible? Or a warning dressed in the clothing of history? To follow Atlantis, we have to move carefully. The sea invites certainty, but it rarely gives it. Every clue seems to shimmer, then shift. A line in an old text becomes a map. A volcanic island becomes a suspect. A strange formation on the ocean floor becomes, for a moment, a vanished city, and still, the image remains. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Tonight, we begin not with proof, but with a shape beneath the waves. An idea so powerful that it has survived longer than many real kingdoms. Atlantis sits at the edge of history and imagination, where philosophy, disaster, ambition, and memory blur together. The deeper we look, the less it behaves like a simple treasure hunt. It becomes something stranger, a test of how civilizations remember fear, and how easily we turn warning into legend. Chapter 2, The First Witness. The first strange thing about Atlantis is how late it arrives. For a story that claims to reach back into a world before recorded Greek memory, Atlantis does not appear in a long chain of ancient sources. It does not come to us first from sailors' logs, temple inscriptions, royal records, or fragments of some lost island's own writing. It arrives almost entirely through one man, Plato. That matters. Plato was not a travel writer, he was not an archaeologist, and he was not trying to produce a documentary record in the modern sense. He was a philosopher, writing in the 4th century BCE, using dialogue, argument, imagined speeches, inherited stories, and carefully shaped examples to examine how societies should live and how they fail. So when Atlantis appears in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, we are already standing on complicated ground. Not false ground, necessarily, but literary ground. In Timaeus, the story is introduced as something ancient, something preserved outside Greece and brought back through memory. In Critias, the details become richer. Atlantis is described as a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name usually associated with the region around the Strait of Gibraltar. It is not presented as a quiet paradise. It is wealthy, organized, ambitious, and dangerous. It rules over other lands. It possesses military strength. It becomes strong enough to threaten the Mediterranean world. And facing it, in Plato's account, is an ancient Athens. Not the Athens Plato knew. Not the city of his own day with its public debates, empire, defeat, and political scars. This is a much older Athens, almost mythic in its virtue. It is disciplined, courageous, restrained, the kind of city Plato often seemed to wish human beings could build, if only they were less easily seduced by wealth and appetite. The war between them is not just a war of armies, it is a moral contrast. Atlantis expands, Athens resists, Atlantis gathers power. Athens stands for order. Then comes the sentence that has echoed for more than 2,000 years. Atlantis is said to have vanished after violent earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the sea in a single day and night. It is one of the most efficient destructions in ancient literature. No long decline, no decades of erosion, no slow abandonment, with weeds creeping through courtyards and roofs collapsing season by season. Plato gives us suddenness. The world is there, and then it is not. That suddenness is part of the spell. A civilization can survive war, famine, bad kings, and bad decisions. But catastrophe is different. Catastrophe interrupts the comforting idea that history moves gradually, that powerful things are allowed time to understand their own ending. Atlantis, as Plato gives it to us, does not get time. It is judged, broken, and removed almost at once. But here is where a careful investigation has to slow down. The fact that Plato is our first real witness does not mean Atlantis was real. It also does not prove he invented every piece of it from nothing. Ancient writers often used older traditions, rearranged stories, borrowed memories of disasters, and gave them new meaning. A myth could carry a trace of an earthquake. A philosophical fable could wear the clothing of genealogy. A political warning could be placed in the mouth of an ancestor, making it feel older, heavier, harder to ignore. So the question is not simply, did Plato lie? That is too blunt, and frankly too modern. A better question is, what kind of truth was Plato trying to create? He gives us enough concrete detail to tempt a mapmaker. Islands, seas, kings, measurements, war, destruction. But he places those details inside a philosophical work concerned with the ideal state, human nature, and the relationship between order and chaos. Atlantis is not introduced casually. It serves a purpose. It gives Plato a grand adversary, a civilization that can be admired for its strength, then condemned for what that strength becomes. That is why the story is so difficult to classify. If Atlantis were purely vague, it might have faded into a minor myth. If it were plainly historical, we would expect independent evidence to gather around it. Instead, it lives in the middle. It is specific enough to feel recoverable, but elusive enough to resist recovery. Plato, the first witness, gives us a city with streets and kings, a war with Athens, and a death by water. But he also gives us a warning about societies that mistake greatness for virtue. And from the beginning, those two versions of Atlantis, the possible place and the moral image, are tangled together. That is why every search for Atlantis eventually returns to the same old pages. Before the sonar scans, before the volcanic theories, before the maps with red circles drawn in the Atlantic, before the television specials lowering cameras into blue darkness, there is Plato. One witness, two dialogues, and a story that may have been history, philosophy, memory, or all three wearing the same mask. Chapter 3. A story passed through too many hands. Atlantis does not come to us directly. That may be the most important thing to understand before trusting any of its details too quickly. Plato does not say, "I saw this." He does not even say, "This was common knowledge among the Greeks." Instead, he builds a chain, and the chain itself becomes part of the mystery. In Plato's telling, the story begins far from Athens, in Egypt. There, Egyptian priests are said to have preserved records far older than Greek memory. They speak to Solon, the famous Athenian lawgiver who had traveled to Egypt generations before Plato. Solon hears the tale of an ancient war, an ancient Athens, and a mighty island power destroyed by catastrophe. He brings the story back. It passes into the family memory of Critias. Then, much later, Critias repeats it in conversation. Plato writes it down. Egyptian priests, Solon, Critias, Plato. Each name gives the story authority. Each step also adds distance, and distance matters. A story carried through many hands can become richer, but not necessarily clearer. Details can survive. They can also harden into certainty simply because they sound old. By the time Atlantis reaches Plato's page, it is already framed as a memory from beyond memory, something the Greeks themselves supposedly forgot, while Egypt preserved it. That is a powerful narrative move. It makes Atlantis feel ancient even to the ancients. The Greeks of Plato's time already thought deeply about the fragility of memory. Cities burned, records disappeared, wars reordered identity. Genealogies stretched backward into heroic ages, where history and myth were not cleanly separated. To say that Egypt remembered what Greece had forgotten was not a random choice. Egypt, to Greek imagination, often represented depth. Old temples, old priesthoods, old knowledge. A civilization whose monuments seem to embarrass the shortness of other people's memories. So when Plato places the origin of the Atlantis story in the mouths of Egyptian priests, he gives it weight before the facts are even examined. It is a little like hearing someone say, "This was found in a sealed archive." We lean forward. We become more willing to listen. But this is also where suspicion enters. The story is not recorded for us by the priests themselves. We do not have the Egyptian document. We do not have Solon's original poem about Atlantis, if such a poem ever existed in the form later implied. We do not have an independent account from Critias outside Plato's literary construction. What we have is Plato presenting a dialogue in which a character recounts a tradition said to have passed down through an impressive line of transmission. That does not make it worthless. It makes it complicated. Ancient storytelling often worked through chains of authority. A speaker did not always prove a story by showing a tablet or naming a modern-style source. He proved it by placing it inside trusted relationships, a priest to a statesman, an elder to a descendant, a remembered conversation to a written dialogue. The chain itself was part of the argument. Yet a chain can also conceal invention. Plato understood the power of framing. He knew that a story feels different when it is presented not as a fresh invention, but as a recovered inheritance. If Atlantis had simply appeared as an obvious fiction, imagine for a moment a rich island empire destroyed by the gods. It might still have served his philosophical purpose, but it would not have gripped the world in the same way. Instead, he gives it a pedigree. The story seems to arrive from somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere official, somewhere beyond ordinary Greek rumor. And that is exactly why Atlantis has been so difficult to kill. People do not only search for Atlantis because Plato describes geography. They search because Plato makes the story feel transmitted rather than invented. He gives readers the sensation that they are overhearing the last surviving trace of a much older archive. But we have to be careful with that sensation. A story can feel ancient because it is ancient. It can also feel ancient because a skilled writer knows how to place it at a distance. Distance creates atmosphere. Distance also creates fog. Think of what happens as the Atlantis story moves through its supposed carriers. The Egyptian priests may represent institutional memory. Solon represents respected Greek wisdom. Critias represents aristocratic family tradition. Plato represents philosophical craftsmanship. By the time all of these layers have been stacked together, Atlantis is no longer merely a lost island. It has become a story with credentials, and yet, every credential is mediated through Plato. This is not a small problem. It is the center of the problem. If Atlantis were supported by Egyptian inscriptions, Bronze Age records, or independent Greek traditions from earlier authors, the investigation would look very different. Instead, we are left with a magnificent narrative object, detailed enough to be fascinating, layered enough to feel plausible, but dependent on a single literary source. That dependence does not force one conclusion. It allows several. Perhaps Plato preserved a genuine tradition, however distorted. Perhaps he reshaped scattered memories of real disasters into a political myth. Perhaps he invented Atlantis with deliberate seriousness, not to deceive, but to teach. The layered transmission keeps all of these possibilities alive because it does two things at once. It strengthens the mood of authenticity and weakens the case for verification. That tension is the engine of the legend. Atlantis feels like a message rescued from deep time. But when we reach for the message, we find not a sealed tablet, not a drowned inscription, not a survivor's report. Only voices repeating voices, and somewhere inside that echo, an island begins to sink. Chapter 4. The Empire Plato wanted us to fear. Atlantis is often imagined as a paradise. White towers, blue canals, golden roofs catching the morning sun. A city of impossible beauty, lost because the gods or the earth itself could no longer bear its brilliance. Modern fantasy has been very kind to Atlantis. It has polished the edges, filled the harbors with crystal light, and turned the whole place into something like a dream vacation with a tragic ending. But that is not really Plato's Atlantis. Plato's Atlantis is impressive, yes. It is rich. It is organized. It has engineering, trade, temples, armies, and command over other lands. It is not presented as primitive or fragile. It is a state at the height of its confidence, a civilization that seems to have everything a society could desire. And that is precisely the danger. In Critias, Atlantis begins with divine favor and noble order. Its rulers descend, in the story, from Poseidon. The island is abundant. Its land produces wealth. Its central city is arranged with striking symmetry, ringed by alternating bands of land and water, like power made visible in architecture. There are docks, walls, metals, temples, and a royal system that binds the island's kings together. It is tempting to read all of that as admiration. Part of it probably is. Plato understood the appeal of a grand civilization. He did not write Atlantis as a crude monster. A warning is much stronger when the thing being warned against is beautiful. Greed rarely arrives looking ugly to the people who practice it. Empire does not usually describe itself as decay. It speaks in the language of order, destiny, security, wealth, and achievement. That is what makes Atlantis interesting. It is not frightening because it is chaotic. It is frightening because it is successful. At first, the Atlanteans seem to possess a kind of disciplined greatness. Their rulers are bound by customs and laws. Their society has structure. Their wealth does not immediately destroy them. But over time, according to Plato's moral logic, something changes. The divine element in them weakens. Human appetite takes over. They become ambitious, grasping, and unable to recognize the limit between rightful strength and domination. That limit is one of Plato's great obsessions. For him, a city is never just a collection of buildings. It is a soul enlarged. If the soul is ruled by reason, the city may become just. If it is ruled by appetite, the city may become powerful, but sick. Atlantis becomes the image of that sickness on an imperial scale. This is where the story becomes sharper than a simple lost world legend. Atlantis is not destroyed because it is advanced. It is destroyed because advancement without moral restraint becomes dangerous. Its wealth does not save it. Its military strength does not save it. Its divine ancestry does not save it. Even its magnificent design becomes almost ironic. Perfect rings enclosing a corrupted center. Opposite Atlantis stands ancient Athens, not the historical Athens of Plato's lifetime exactly. That Athens had its own complicated record. Democracy, empire, brilliance, defeat, faction, execution, ambition. Plato knew very well that real Athens was not innocent. He had watched politics damage lives. He had seen how public opinion could become unstable, how civic pride could become cruelty, how a city could admire wisdom and still condemn a philosopher. So when he presents an ancient Athens capable of resisting Atlantis, he is not merely praising his homeland. He is creating a contrast. Athens, in this older, idealized form, becomes the city of restraint. Atlantis becomes the city of excess. One stands for measured courage, the other for expansion that has forgotten its own moral boundary. The war between them is therefore more than a military episode. It is a test case. What happens when a rich and aggressive power meets a poorer but more virtuous society? What happens when empire mistakes conquest for greatness? What happens when a civilization can build almost anything except the discipline to govern itself? These are not questions trapped in the 4th century BCE. They are the reason Atlantis keeps returning. A purely archaeological Atlantis would be fascinating, of course. Divers would descend. Scholars would argue over pottery. Museums would build rooms around recovered fragments. But Plato's Atlantis has survived partly because it is not only about what may have been lost underwater. It is about what can go wrong on land, again and again, in full daylight. That is also why some readers believe Atlantis was designed primarily as a philosophical instrument. It gives Plato a vast example. Instead of saying, in abstract terms, that luxury corrupts and imperial ambition destroys justice, he turns that argument into a civilization. He gives greed harbors, he gives pride a navy, he gives moral decline a palace, and then he sinks it. There is a brutal elegance to that. The destruction of Atlantis is not random in the story's moral universe. It is judgment. Whether we read it literally or symbolically, the catastrophe completes the warning. The city that could not master itself is mastered by forces beyond itself. The empire that tried to extend outward is pulled downward. Yet we should not flatten Plato's account into a sermon too quickly. The details of Atlantis are too lush, too specific, too strangely memorable. That is part of the difficulty. A philosopher who invents a warning does not need canals, medals, kings, measurements, and ancestral ceremonies. He could have used a simpler tale. Instead, Plato gives Atlantis a body dense enough to cast a shadow. Maybe that was deliberate artistry. Maybe it drew from older stories, maybe both. But the moral architecture is unmistakable. Atlantis is the empire Plato wanted us to fear because it represents the most dangerous kind of failure. Not weakness, but strength without wisdom. A poor city can collapse from need. A careless city can collapse from disorder. But Atlantis shows a more disturbing possibility, that abundance itself can become a trap. A society may grow so wealthy that it mistakes comfort for virtue, so powerful that it mistakes obedience for peace, so admired that it stops asking whether it deserves admiration. And perhaps that is why the legend does not lose its force, even when the geography begins to crumble. We can argue about where Atlantis was supposed to be. We can test the Atlantic floor. We can compare it with Santorini, Crete, Spain, the Azores, and every hopeful coastline drawn into the debate. But Plato's deeper target was never only a place. It was a pattern. An empire rises, it shines, it conquers. It forgets the difference between greatness and goodness. Then the sea closes over it, not just as water, but as a sentence. Chapter 5. The Impossible Geography. Sooner or later, every search for Atlantis runs into the same problem. The story wants a map. It almost demands one. Plato does not leave Atlantis floating in a purely dreamlike space. He gives it direction. He gives it distance. He places it beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a phrase ancient readers would usually associate with the far western edge of the Mediterranean, near the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond those pillars, Plato says, lay a great island. From there, other islands could be reached, and beyond them, a larger surrounding continent. For anyone hoping Atlantis was real, this is irresistible. There is a doorway. There is a sea beyond the doorway. There is an island somewhere past the known edge of the Greek world. The imagination immediately begins to move west. Out through the Mediterranean, past the narrow strait, into the Atlantic, where the water opens and the old maps become less confident. For generations, this single geographical clue has helped send Atlantis hunters toward the Azores, the Canary Islands, the Mid-Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the edges of continents that Plato could not have known in any ordinary way. But the clue that makes Atlantis feel locatable also makes it harder to defend. If Plato meant a vast island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, not merely near the mouth of the Mediterranean, but far beyond it, then modern geology becomes a very stubborn witness. The Atlantic is not an empty page waiting for a missing continent. Its floor has been mapped, measured, sampled, and studied. We know the difference between oceanic crust and continental crust. We know that large continental landmasses do not simply drop intact into the deep ocean in a single day and night. Islands can explode. Coastlines can drown. Earthquakes can lower land. Tsunamis can erase settlements. But a continent-sized Atlantis sinking into the middle of the Atlantic is not something the geology supports. This is where romance meets rock. And rock is not easily impressed. The ocean floor tells its own history in ridges, trenches, sediments, fracture zones, and volcanic chains. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, for example, is not the scar of a drowned empire. It is a vast tectonic boundary where plates move apart and new oceanic crust forms. The Azores are volcanic islands, not the mountaintops of a sunken continent. The Atlantic Basin has a physical story, and that story does not have much room for Plato's giant vanished island in the way later imagination often pictures it. This does not mean all ancient flood stories are false. It does not mean no coastal city was ever lost. It does not mean human memory could not preserve the shock of earthquakes, rising seas, volcanic destruction, or ports swallowed by sudden waves. But it does mean we have to separate two questions that are often mixed together. Could real disasters inspire legends of drowned places? Yes. Did an enormous advanced island empire sink beneath the Atlantic? Exactly as many modern Atlantis theories imagine. The evidence does not support that. That distinction is not a small technicality. It is the boundary between historical imagination and wishful cartography. The phrase, "beyond the Pillars of Heracles," itself also creates complications. Ancient geographical language was not always as precise as a modern coordinate system. Boundaries could be symbolic as well as literal. To the Greeks, the far west could represent distance, danger, and the edge of reliable knowledge. Placing a story beyond the pillars may have meant more than "go exactly here and start digging," and it may have signaled that the events belonged in a world just outside the familiar order. And still, Plato's wording is too concrete to ignore. This is why Atlantis theories never quite die. The geography is loose enough to bend, but specific enough to tempt. If one detail does not fit, a theory can shift the island closer to Spain. If the Atlantic is geologically impossible, perhaps Plato misunderstood an Egyptian reference. If the date is wrong, perhaps numbers were mistranslated. If the island is too large, perhaps island meant a region, a coast, a cultural zone, or a memory folded through time. Sometimes that kind of adjustment is reasonable. Ancient texts do survive through misunderstanding. Measurements can be distorted. Names can migrate. Stories can be retold across languages. But there is a danger. If every failed clue can be explained away, the theory stops being tested. It becomes protected. Atlantis can be placed anywhere because the evidence is allowed to mean anything. A responsible investigation has to resist that. Plato's geography should neither be worshipped nor casually dismissed. It should be weighed. The Pillars of Heracles tell us that he wanted readers to look west, beyond the known Mediterranean boundary. The Great Island tells us he imagined something large and politically powerful, not a minor fishing village. The surrounding ocean gives the story scale. But modern seafloor science tells us that the most dramatic version, a vast Atlantic continent destroyed and submerged, is almost certainly not what happened in the physical world. That leaves us with a more subtle possibility. Maybe Plato used geography not as a treasure map, but as a stage. By placing Atlantis beyond the western threshold, he set it outside ordinary Greek experience. It was close enough to threaten the Mediterranean, but distant enough to feel legendary. The setting made Atlantis both political and mythic, an empire from the edge of the world, pressing inward against a virtuous Athens. That is elegant storytelling. It is also exactly the kind of thing that can mislead later readers who want the stage to become an archaeological site. There are real drowned landscapes in human history. There are ancient ports now underwater. There are islands reshaped by eruption. There are cities damaged by earthquakes and coastlines changed by the sea. The world does not lack catastrophe, but Atlantis, as Plato draws it, stretches beyond the scale of ordinary disaster into something larger, cleaner, more symbolic. That is the trouble with the map. It gives us just enough to begin the search, and just enough to doubt the search was ever meant to succeed. The Atlantic remains enormous, dark, and persuasive. It feels capable of hiding anything. But the deeper we examine the physical evidence, the more the vanished empire begins to look less like a missing continent and more like an idea placed deliberately beyond the horizon, where philosophy could borrow the authority of geography and mystery could wear the shape of a place. Chapter 6. The ocean gives no easy answers. The deep sea is a perfect accomplice. It is vast enough to protect almost any fantasy, dark enough to soften the edges of evidence, and distant enough that most of us will never see it with our own eyes. On land, a claim can often be tested with a shovel, a survey, a road trip, or a skeptical archaeologist standing in the dust with a notebook. Underwater, everything feels harder, more expensive, more dramatic, more open to suggestion. That is one reason Atlantis belongs so naturally to the sea. A buried city in a desert asks to be excavated. A lost temple in a jungle asks to be cleared. But a drowned empire in the Atlantic can always retreat a little farther down, a little farther out, beyond the reach of ordinary proof. The ocean gives mystery a place to hide without looking completely unreasonable. After all, the sea really has swallowed human places. Ancient harbors now lie beneath water. Earthquakes have dropped coastlines. Tsunamis have broken settlements apart. Ships, statues, cargo, walls, anchors, and bones have all been recovered from the seabed. Underwater archaeology is not fantasy. It has revealed real chapters of human history that land-based excavation would never have touched. But that truth has also made people careless. Because some things are hidden under the sea, people begin to imagine that almost anything could be hidden there. And Atlantis has benefited from that leap more than any other legend. In modern times, the search has taken on the language of technology. Sonar scans, bathymetric maps, satellite imagery, seafloor surveys, remotely operated vehicles moving through black water with lights like small artificial moons. These tools are extraordinary. They have transformed our understanding of the ocean floor. They can reveal ridges, channels, wrecks, volcanic cones, landslides, and submerged landscapes with detail that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. But technology does not remove interpretation. It only gives us new things to interpret. A grid-like pattern on a map may look like streets. A long straight feature may look like a road. A rectangular shadow may look like a wall. The human mind is very good at turning patterns into intentions. It is one of our strengths. It is also one of our weaknesses. We recognize faces in clouds, animals in stars, and cities in seabed noise. The ocean floor is full of shapes that seem deliberate until they are understood. Natural fractures can create straight lines. Lava flows can form terraces and edges. Sediment channels can appear organized. Erosion can carve steps and platforms. Coral, basalt, sand waves, and collapsed rock can produce forms that feel architectural when viewed from a distance. Add low-resolution imaging, dramatic lighting, and the desire to find something, and a geological accident can begin to look like a lost avenue. This does not mean every underwater claim should be laughed away. Some discoveries begin as anomalies. Archaeology has often advanced because someone noticed that a strange shape was not just a strange shape. The difference is not whether a pattern is exciting. The difference is whether it survives better evidence. A real ancient city does not usually consist of one suggestive line on a scan. It leaves clusters of evidence, tool marks, ceramics, worked stone, construction logic, datable material, cultural context, nearby settlement patterns, signs that human beings lived, built, repaired, traded, cooked, prayed, stored, broke, and abandoned things there. Ruins are not only shapes, they are systems. Atlantis claims often struggle at exactly this point. They begin with an image that feels persuasive from far away, then weaken as the camera moves closer. What looked like masonry becomes fractured rock. What looked like a road becomes a natural pavement. What looked like a harbor becomes a sand formation. What looked like a geometric city turns out to be a mapping artifact, a technical pattern produced by how data was collected and stitched together. There is something almost poetic about that. The more clearly we see the sea, the more often Atlantis dissolves. Yet the opposite also happens in the public imagination. A correction rarely travels as far as the original claim. The first headline says a possible lost city has been found. The later explanation says the feature is probably natural, or the data was misread, or there is no archaeological material. The first version glows. The second one files paperwork. Mystery is more shareable than geology, and Atlantis thrives in that gap. It helps that the ocean feels emotionally different from land. A strange hill can be just a hill. A strange line in a field can be checked by walking across it, but a strange line on the seabed seems to belong to another world. It arrives on a screen already translated through machines. We are not looking at the thing itself. We are looking at a rendering, a contour, a shadow, a measurement. That distance gives the imagination room to breathe. Sometimes too much room. A sonar image is not a photograph in the familiar sense. It is a record of reflected sound, processed into a form we can read. Bathymetric maps can exaggerate relief. Satellite-based images of the seafloor may include gaps and corrections. Survey paths can leave patterns that resemble grids. When these images circulate without explanation, they become visual rumors, and visual rumors are powerful. People believe what they can see, even when they do not fully understand how the seeing was made. This is why the ocean gives no easy answers. It is not because scientists refuse wonder, or because evidence is being hidden away in some convenient vault. It is because underwater evidence is genuinely difficult, and because difficulty creates a space where hope, error, and commercial storytelling can mingle. A camera descending into blue darkness is good television. A sediment core is less glamorous. A seafloor survey that finds no city is harder to dramatize than one strange formation that might, for a few breathless minutes, be a wall. But careful work matters precisely because the ocean is so suggestive. Without discipline, every ridge becomes a ruin. Every shadow becomes a temple. Every unexplained shape becomes Atlantis, at least until the next one appears. The real lesson of these searches is not that the sea is empty. It is that the sea is not obligated to confirm our legends. It contains wrecks, drowned ports, ancient coastlines, and histories still waiting to be studied. It also contains enormous stretches of geology that were never touched by human hands. The challenge is learning to tell the difference without letting desire make the decision first. Atlantis remains powerful because the ocean still looks like a possible hiding place. Even now, with all our instruments, the deep sea feels unfinished in the human mind. It preserves the old feeling that something immense could be resting below us, just beyond the reach of light. But the better our maps become, the more the legend is forced to change shape. It can no longer comfortably be a missing Atlantic continent. It becomes a memory, a metaphor, a mislocated disaster, a philosophical construction. or perhaps some mixture of all of these. The ocean has not delivered Plato's empire. It has delivered something more frustrating and more useful: limits. And limits are not the enemy of mystery. They are what keep mystery honest. The sea may hide many things. It has hidden enough real history to deserve our respect. But if Atlantis lies there, as Plato described it, then it has left behind a silence unusually complete. No confirmed ruins, no clear material culture, no unmistakable city waiting in the dark. Only patterns, only echoes, only the old temptation to mistake the shape of the seabed for the shape of a dream. Chapter 7. Santorini, the island that exploded. There is a moment in the Atlantis investigation when the search turns away from the open Atlantic and comes back into the Mediterranean. It is not a retreat exactly. It is more like a change in temperature. The grand oceanic mystery gives way to a smaller, sharper, more historically grounded possibility. Perhaps Atlantis was not a vanished continent at all. Perhaps behind Plato's story, there was a memory of a real Bronze Age catastrophe, and that is where Santorini enters. Today, Santorini is often imagined through postcards: white buildings on cliffs, blue domes, terraces above a flooded caldera, sunsets polished by tourism until they almost seem unreal. But beneath that beauty is the broken shape of an explosion. The island was once part of a larger volcanic landmass known in antiquity as Thera. In the late Bronze Age, it erupted with extraordinary violence. The eruption did not merely damage a city, it remade a landscape. Ash fell, pumice spread. The volcanic center collapsed. The sea rushed into the wounded space, creating the caldera that gives Santorini its dramatic form today. For the people of the Aegean world, this was not a distant geological event. It was a shock moving through the air, the sea, and the trade routes of a connected maritime culture. Here, for the first time, Atlantis begins to feel less like a fantasy and more like an echo, a powerful island world, a maritime civilization, sudden destruction, earthquakes, floods, and fire from beneath the earth. A disaster so dramatic that later generations might remember it in distorted form. No wonder Santorini has become one of the strongest historical comparisons. The eruption of Thera is not imaginary. The ash is real. The destroyed landscape is real. The archaeological remains are real. And nearby, across the Aegean, was the Minoan civilization of Crete, wealthy, artistic, seafaring, and influential in ways that later Greek memory may not have preserved cleanly. If one wanted a real-world seed for a legend of a brilliant island power struck by catastrophe, the Aegean offers far more than the empty middle of the Atlantic. But the appeal of the Santorini theory can also make it too easy. The eruption was immense, but it was not Atlantis in a simple one-to-one sense. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, not in the Cyclades. He describes a great empire fighting an ancient Athens, not a Bronze Age volcanic settlement destroyed by ash. His chronology is far older than the Thera eruption. His geography is larger. His political story is different. So why does the comparison still matter? Because legends do not always preserve events as neat reports. They preserve impressions. A society does not need to remember the exact volcanic chemistry of an eruption to remember that the world broke open. It does not need to keep the date correct to carry forward the terror of the sea rising where it should not rise, or the sky darkening over harbors, or a prosperous island becoming unlivable. Human memory, especially across centuries, can compress, relocate, moralize, and enlarge. A catastrophe can become a lesson. A lesson can become a myth. A myth can later be mistaken for a map. The Thera eruption may have produced tsunamis that affected parts of the Aegean, including coastal areas connected to Minoan life. It may have disrupted trade, damaged ports, and contributed to wider instability. How directly it caused the decline of Minoan power remains debated. Civilizations rarely fall because of one clean event, no matter how tempting that is for storytellers. Political change, economic strain, conflict, environmental stress, and later Mycenaean influence all complicate the picture. Still, catastrophe has a way of exposing weaknesses that were already there. An eruption may not have ended Minoan civilization by itself, but it could have changed the balance. It could have damaged fleets, crops, confidence, religious authority, and the delicate networks by which a maritime culture survived. A palace society depends not only on walls and rulers, but on rhythm. Ships arriving, goods circulating, rituals continuing, elites appearing stable. Break the rhythm hard enough, and even a sophisticated world can begin to look fragile. That is one reason the Atlantis comparison is so compelling. Plato's story is about more than drowning. It is about the humiliation of power. Atlantis is great, and then greatness fails. The Aegean Bronze Age offers a real example of how sudden natural violence could strike a complex island-connected world and leave later generations with only fragments of understanding. Imagine, not as fact but as possibility, what a survivor's account might become after centuries. There was an island. It was wealthy. Its people crossed the sea. There were palaces, painted walls, ships, ceremonies, and goods from far places. Then the earth shook. The sky changed. The water came. Over generations, the specifics could loosen. The island could grow larger. Its influence could become empire. Its disaster could become punishment. Its memory could migrate westward, placed beyond the edge of the known world, because that is where great lost things belong. This is not proof. It is a plausible mechanism. And in the Atlantis debate, mechanisms matter. They explain how a story could be both untrue in detail and connected to something real. Santorini gives us a model for disaster transformed into legend. It shows that the ancient Mediterranean did experience events dramatic enough to scar memory. It also reminds us that the most convincing theories are not always the ones that match every line of Plato, but the ones that explain why such a story could have felt believable in the first place. The island itself seems almost designed to encourage this kind of thinking. Stand on the rim of the caldera, and the sea below does not look peaceful. It looks like an absence filled with water. The cliffs curve around the void. Boats move across the surface where land once stood. The landscape teaches, without needing to speak, that the earth is not as permanent as human beings like to pretend. That lesson is very close to Atlantis. Not identical. Close. And perhaps closeness is the honest place to leave Santorini for now. It is not Plato's island beyond the Atlantic threshold. It is not the enemy empire described in Critias. It does not solve the mystery cleanly. But it gives the legend a pulse. It shows us a real island world broken by forces too large to negotiate with. It shows us how beauty can sit on the rim of violence. It shows us why ancient people might remember the sea not only as a road or a source of food, or a border, but as something capable of taking a civilization's confidence and folding it into myth. Atlantis may not be Santorini, but after Santorini, Atlantis no longer feels like it came from nowhere. Chapter 8. Akrotiri, a city, frozen before the ash. Long before Santorini became a symbol of beauty, one of its cities disappeared under volcanic debris. Not drowned, not erased by invading armies, not slowly abandoned until goats wandered through the streets. Buried. The place is called Akrotiri, and it changes the feeling of the Atlantis question, because it gives us something the legend itself has never given us: a real ancient city preserved by disaster. Akrotiri was a Bronze Age settlement on Thera, the island we now know as Santorini. When the volcano erupted, layers of ash and pumice sealed parts of the town beneath them. The result is one of those rare archaeological situations where catastrophe becomes, in a strange way, preservation. Walls remain. Streets can be traced. Multi-story buildings, storage spaces, drainage systems, painted interiors, imported goods, and signs of wide trade all speak of a society that was not isolated, not primitive, and not waiting at the edge of the world. It was connected. That word matters. Atlantis is often imagined as a lonely island kingdom, sealed away in some blue distance. Akrotiri shows a different kind of island life, one made powerful by connection. Ships, goods, images, ideas, and habits moved across the Aegean. The sea was not a wall. It was a road. In the buildings of Akrotiri, archaeologists found frescoes that still feel startlingly alive. Landscapes, animals, people, ritual scenes, ships. These are not the remains of a culture without memory or imagination. They suggest a community fluent in beauty, trade, seafaring, and social organization. Even in fragments, the city has texture. It has rooms where people stored food, spaces where they moved through daily routines, walls where color survived longer than the voices that once passed beside it. This is the kind of discovery that makes Atlantis hunters lean forward. Here, at last, is a city lost to volcanic catastrophe. Here is an island associated with a powerful maritime world. Here is advanced architecture, art, trade, and sudden burial. Here is proof that the ancient Aegean contained places capable of inspiring awe and disasters capable of turning that awe into legend. But Akrotiri also teaches caution, because the closer we look, the less it behaves like Plato's Atlantis. It was not a vast empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles. It was not described by its own evidence as a conquering power attacking ancient Athens. It did not vanish beneath the Atlantic. It was a real settlement in the Aegean, shaped by the Bronze Age world around it, and preserved because volcanic material sealed it away. To force it into Plato's account too tightly would be to damage both stories, the archaeological one and the philosophical one. And yet, the resemblance is not meaningless. It belongs to a different category of evidence, not proof of Atlantis, but proof of possibility. Akrotiri proves that ancient island societies could be sophisticated. It proves that a thriving settlement could be overwhelmed by natural violence. It proves that memory of such a disaster, passed through generations and cultures, could have had real emotional force. What it does not prove is that Plato's Atlantis was a disguised report about this particular city. That difference may sound dry, but it is essential. A careful investigation does not ask one site to explain everything. It asks what each site can honestly carry. Akrotiri can carry the weight of a real lost city. It can carry the shock of Thera's eruption. It can carry the image of an Aegean society interrupted at the height of its complexity. But it cannot carry the whole Atlantic empire on its back. There is also a quiet detail that complicates the drama. Unlike some disaster sites, Akrotiri has not yielded the kind of mass human remains one might expect from a city caught completely unaware. That has led many scholars to suggest that people may have had warning before the final destructive phase and evacuated, at least in significant numbers. If so, the story becomes less like a city instantly killed in place and more like a place abandoned under threat, then sealed by the eruption. That is less cinematic. It may also be more human. Imagine the decision, if there was one. Tremors, smoke, ash, the unsettling behavior of the earth. People gathering what could be carried, leaving behind what could not. Doors closing for the last time without anyone knowing whether they would return. A city does not need bodies in the streets to be tragic. Sometimes tragedy is an empty room preserved too well. That emptiness makes Akrotiri powerful in a way Atlantis is not. Atlantis overwhelms us with scale. Akrotiri works through nearness. You can imagine hands on walls, feet on stairways, jars stored against plaster, someone looking toward the sea and wondering whether the ships would leave in time. It reminds us that catastrophe is not only a grand historical event, it is also a sequence of small, private interruptions. A meal not finished, a room not re-entered, a painted wall never seen again by the people who lived beside it. This is where Akrotiri may be most valuable to the Atlantis mystery. It brings the legend down from the clouds. It reminds us that the ancient world did not need fictional super-civilizations to experience loss. Real communities with real skills and real networks could be broken by forces beyond their control. The Earth itself could become the author of an ending. At the same time, Akrotiri resists becoming a convenient answer, and perhaps that resistance is what makes it more interesting. The site does not solve Plato. It corrects our imagination. It shows that the search for Atlantis should not be only a hunt for a perfect match, because perfect matches are often created by ignoring what does not fit. Instead, Akrotiri asks us to think about how stories are punished from partial memory. A city here, an eruption there, a maritime culture beyond the horizon. A later philosopher giving old fears a new moral shape. The result may not be history in the narrow sense, but it may not be pure invention either. Akrotiri stands in that middle territory, not Atlantis, but something real enough to explain why Atlantis felt possible. A city once full of color and trade, sealed before it could decay, waiting under ash while centuries of speculation rose above it. And in the end, that may be more haunting than a perfect answer. Because Atlantis remains unfound. Akrotiri was found, and when the Earth finally gave it back, it did not reveal a fantasy empire with golden walls and world-conquering kings. It revealed something quieter and maybe more valuable. The life of an ancient city interrupted, preserved at the edge of disaster, reminding us that the past does not need to be exaggerated to be mysterious. Chapter 9. Crete and the Shadow of the Minoans. If Santorini gives Atlantis its explosion, Crete gives it a civilization large enough to cast a shadow. The Minoans were not Atlanteans. That needs to be said plainly, because the temptation to merge them is strong. Crete had palaces, ships, art, ritual, wealth, and influence across the Aegean. It had enough strangeness, from a later Greek point of view, to become fertile ground for myth. But it was not an island empire beyond the Atlantic threshold, and it does not step neatly into Plato's description like a missing piece finally returned to the puzzle. Still, Crete matters, because if we are searching for the kind of world that could have fed the Atlantis legend, not as a perfect original, but as a deep memory altered over time, Minoan civilization is impossible to ignore. Long before classical Athens imagined itself as the center of Greek life, Crete had already been home to a palace culture of remarkable sophistication. At sites like Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, the remains point toward a society that organized labor, stored goods, traded widely, decorated its walls with vivid images, and developed rituals that later viewers have often found both beautiful and difficult to interpret. Bulls appear again and again, so do processions, sea creatures, plants, women in elaborate dress, and scenes that seem to move with ceremonial energy. The Minoan world does not feel like the later marble Greece of textbooks. It feels older, more fluid, more colorful, more maritime. That difference may have mattered enormously to Greek memory. Later, Greeks looked back on Crete through layers of myth. King Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur, Theseus, tribute from Athens, and a powerful island ruler whose reach extended across the sea. These stories are not straightforward history, but they suggest that Crete remained in the Greek imagination as a place of ancient authority, strange rituals, and sea power. And here, the Atlantis question becomes more subtle. Plato's Atlantis fights ancient Athens. Minoan Crete, in Greek myth, also appears in relation to Athens, sometimes as a dominant power demanding tribute. That does not make Atlantis a coded version of Crete, but it does show that the idea of an older island power imposing itself on Greece was already available in the mythic imagination. A powerful island, a maritime reach, a memory of conflict with Athens. A later Greek need to explain an older, impressive, partly vanished world. These ingredients do not prove anything by themselves, but together they help explain why Atlantis could sound plausible to an ancient audience. The Minoans were not merely wealthy because they sat on land. Their strength came from movement. Crete occupied a central position in the eastern Mediterranean, and Minoan goods and artistic influence spread through networks of exchange. Ships linked island to island, harbor to harbor, palace to palace. To a later land-focused reader, that kind of power can be difficult to picture. It leaves fewer borders on a map. It is not always empire in the Roman sense. It may be influence, trade, prestige, religious connection, and control of routes. But to those living within it, such a sea network could feel immense. This is one reason the modern word thalassocracy is often brought into discussions of Minoan power, rule or dominance by sea. The term can be useful, but it can also oversimplify. We should be careful not to imagine Crete as a uniform naval empire with flags planted everywhere like a modern colonial power. The evidence points to influence and connectivity, but the exact political shape of that influence remains debated. The uncertainty is important. It keeps us from turning the Minoans into whatever Atlantis needs them to be. What we can say with more confidence is that Crete represented a kind of advanced island world that later Greeks did not fully inherit in direct memory. By Plato's day, the Bronze Age palaces were long gone. Their scripts were not part of ordinary Greek literacy. Their rituals had been transformed into myths. Their ruins, where visible, may have seemed like relics of a mighty age whose real history had slipped out of reach. That is exactly the sort of gap where legends grow. When people encounter the remains of a past more impressive than their knowledge of it, imagination rushes in. A collapsed palace becomes a king's maze. A ritual involving bulls becomes a monster story. Maritime influence becomes domination. Political decline becomes divine punishment. History does not disappear cleanly. It leaves shapes behind, and later societies explain those shapes with the stories they have. The decline of Minoan civilization adds another layer. After the eruption of Thera, the Minoan world appears to have continued, but changed. The eruption may have damaged coastal settlements and disrupted trade, but it was not a simple instant ending. Later, Mycenaean Greek influence became stronger on Crete. Palatial centers shifted. Some were destroyed or reorganized. The old Minoan order faded into something else. This is less satisfying than the Atlantis version. There is no single wave closing over everything, no clean moral judgment in one day and night. Instead, there is a more realistic pattern: shock, survival, adaptation, pressure, takeover, transformation. Civilizations often end by becoming unrecognizable, not by vanishing all at once. But that slow complexity may be exactly what myth cannot easily preserve. A story does not always remember administrative change. It remembers the palace burned, the old power gone, the sea people weakened, the island that once mattered now belonging to the past. Over centuries, the historical process can be compressed into catastrophe. Atlantis may be one such compression, or it may not. The evidence does not allow us to say that Plato sat down with a Minoan memory and renamed it Atlantis. That would be too neat, and the ancient world rarely rewards neatness. But it is reasonable to see Minoan Crete as part of the wider imaginative background, a real Bronze Age maritime civilization, remembered imperfectly by later Greeks, associated with power, wealth, ritual, and decline. In that sense, Crete does not give us Atlantis as a place. It gives us Atlantis as a possibility of memory. A later philosopher, inheriting a world full of myths about old island powers and real traces of destroyed palace cultures, could shape those fragments into something larger. He could move the setting west. He could enlarge the scale. He could sharpen the moral contrast. He could take the unease surrounding wealth, sea power, and forgotten collapse and give it a single name: Atlantis. What makes the Minoans so valuable to this investigation is not that they solve the mystery, but that they make the mystery historically intelligible. They show that behind the legend may stand not one lost island, but a whole atmosphere of remembered Bronze Age power. Cities ruined, scripts unread, palaces abandoned, myths thickening around the remains. Crete is the shadow behind the shadow, not the sunken empire itself, but a reminder that the ancient Mediterranean had already seen worlds rise high enough to become legendary and fall far enough that later generations had to explain them with monsters, kings, gods, and warnings. And once we understand that, Atlantis begins to look less like an isolated fantasy. It begins to look like a story built from the ruins of many memories. Chapter 10. The Dates That Refuse to Align. Dates are where beautiful theories often begin to suffer. A location can be argued over. A name can be reinterpreted. A distance can be blamed on translation, memory, or exaggeration. But chronology is less forgiving. It sits quietly in its corner of the room, waiting for the excitement to calm down. Then it asks the simple question most legends would rather avoid. When? For Atlantis, this is one of the sharpest problems. In Plato's account, the war between Atlantis and ancient Athens is placed thousands of years before Solon. The numbers are enormous, pushing the story back into a time far earlier than the Bronze Age world of Minoan Crete and Santorini. If taken literally, Plato's chronology does not land us near the eruption of Thera. It takes us much deeper into a prehistoric landscape where the political and architectural details he describes become extremely difficult to reconcile with known evidence. This is inconvenient, and because it is inconvenient, it has attracted a great deal of explanation. Some have suggested that the numbers were misunderstood. Perhaps Egyptian priests spoke in lunar years, not solar years. Perhaps a zero was added somewhere. Perhaps a figure that should have been hundreds became thousands. Perhaps Plato, or a source before him, stretched the date to make the story feel more ancient, more majestic, more distant from ordinary memory. These ideas are not all foolish. Ancient transmission could distort numbers. Calendars differed. Copying errors happened. Oral traditions could expand with retelling. A date in an ancient text is not always a modern timestamp pinned cleanly to a wall. But there is a difference between recognizing uncertainty and using uncertainty as a tool to rescue a theory at any cost. That difference matters. The Santorini comparison works best when Plato's numbers are loosened. If Atlantis is allowed to shift from a remote prehistoric age into the late Bronze Age, then the parallels become much more appealing. A maritime culture, volcanic destruction, tsunamis, Minoan influence, and later Greek memory. The theory breathes more easily once the chronology is softened. But softening one problem can create another. If we decide Plato's date is wrong, then we must ask why we are still treating other details as reliable. Why keep the destruction, but discard the time? Why keep the island, but move it? Why keep the sea power, but change the geography? At what point are we reconstructing a lost memory? And at what point are we simply selecting the pieces that make the story fit what we already want to find? This is not a small criticism. It is the central danger in Atlantis research. The most attractive theories often survive because they are flexible, too flexible. When a detail fits, it is treated as evidence. When it does not fit, it becomes metaphor, error, exaggeration, mistranslation, priestly confusion, or philosophical symbolism. One adjustment may be reasonable. Several may still be possible. But if the entire structure depends on explaining away every resistant detail, the theory begins to reveal more about our desire than about the past. The Minoan theory feels powerful because it connects Atlantis to real history. That is its strength. But the dates refuse to align cleanly. The eruption of Thera belongs to the late Bronze Age, while Plato's account places Atlantis far earlier. To bridge that gap, we must accept that the story changed dramatically before reaching him. That could have happened, but it must be admitted. A distorted memory is not the same thing as a direct report. If Atlantis contains an echo of Thera or Minoan decline, then it is an echo altered by time, politics, storytelling, and Plato's own philosophical design. It would not be Atlantis found in the simple sense. It would be Atlantis explained as a hybrid, part memory, part moral argument, part ancient prestige, part literary architecture. In some ways, that is more interesting. A perfect match would end the mystery quickly. A distorted match asks us to think about how people remember catastrophe. Dates are not always preserved with the same force as images. A collapsing island, a darkened sky, a sea wave, a broken palace. These can outlive the calendar. Human memory is often visual and emotional before it is chronological. It remembers the wound before it remembers the year. But historians cannot live on atmosphere alone. They need sequences. They need material evidence. They need to know what existed at the time a story claims it existed. If Plato's Atlantis is placed thousands of years too early for the Minoan world, then we cannot simply wave the problem away because the comparison feels meaningful. The date forces humility. It reminds us that resemblance is not identity. Santorini can resemble Atlantis in certain dramatic features and still not be its source. Minoan Crete can resemble Atlantis in its maritime influence and still not be Plato's island. A later Greek memory of Bronze Age collapse can help explain the legend without proving that every part of the legend descends from one event. This is where the investigation becomes less like a treasure hunt and more like a study of distortion. Imagine a story traveling across centuries. Each generation preserves what matters to it and loses what does not. The exact date becomes vague. The place shifts outward. The scale increases. A local disaster becomes a world historical punishment. A complex decline becomes a single catastrophic night. A powerful but imperfect island culture becomes an empire so proud that nature itself seems to sentence it. By the time the story reaches Plato, it may carry traces of older experiences while serving an entirely new purpose. Or Plato may have invented the chronology precisely because he wanted Atlantis outside normal history. The vast age gives the story authority. It makes Athens ancient beyond ordinary pride. It makes the conflict feel foundational, as if justice and imperial arrogance had been tested at the beginning of civilization itself. The impossible date may not be a mistake. It may be part of the design. That possibility should make us pause. Sometimes the detail that frustrates historical reconstruction is the detail that reveals literary intention. Plato did not merely say Atlantis was old. He made it impossibly old. That distance gives the story mythic force. It removes Atlantis from easy verification. It places the ideal Athens and the corrupted empire in a deep moral past, where philosophy can operate with the grandeur of legend. So the dates do not simply weaken Atlantis theories. They tell us what kind of story we may be dealing with. If the dates are literal, Atlantis becomes almost impossible to place in known ancient history. If the dates are distorted, then the story may preserve a memory, but only after major transformation. If the dates are symbolic or literary, then Atlantis may belong primarily to Plato's philosophical imagination, borrowing the texture of antiquity to make a warning feel older than politics. None of these options gives us the clean answer people usually want. But clean answers are not always honest ones. The dates refuse to align because Atlantis lives between categories. It is too detailed to dismiss casually, too unsupported to accept literally, too morally structured to treat as simple reportage, and too persistent to ignore as a minor invention. Chronology does not destroy the mystery. It narrows what the mystery can responsibly be, and perhaps that is useful. It tells us not to look for Atlantis as though every line of Plato must point to one buried city, one eruption, one island, one map coordinate. The legend may be older and younger than it claims at the same time. Older in the fears it carries, younger in the form Plato gave it. The sea may have swallowed cities. Volcanoes may have broken islands. Bronze Age powers may have faded into myth. But the Atlantis we inherit is also a work of arrangement, shaped by a philosopher who understood that the past becomes most powerful when it is just far enough away to be untouchable. Chapter 11. The Many Atlantics. Once Atlantis breaks free from Plato's page, it begins to multiply. There is not one Atlantis anymore. There are many. Each one has a coastline, a theory, a champion, a set of clues that seem convincing when arranged in the right light. Atlantis has been placed near Spain, among the Azores, off the coast of North Africa, in the Caribbean, around the Canary Islands, and in still more distant places where geography becomes part evidence, part longing. At first, this variety feels exciting. If so many places resemble Atlantis, perhaps the story is leaving fingerprints everywhere. Perhaps the legend scattered itself across the map, waiting for someone patient enough to connect the pieces. But the more locations appear, the more careful we have to become. A theory can begin with one strong resemblance: a marshy region near a strait, a circular landscape seen from above, a place associated with ancient floods, an island chain rising from deep water, a coastline that looks as though it once held something larger. Then the search begins to gather supporting details: old names, local myths, unusual stones, ancient trade, damaged ruins, satellite images, fragments of classical geography. Some of these details may be genuinely interesting. The problem is not that every proposed site is absurd. The problem is that resemblance is easy to find when the target is elastic. Atlantis is large, so a large place can fit. Atlantis is an island, so an island can fit. Atlantis is beyond the Pillars of Heracles, so a western site can fit. Atlantis is destroyed by water, so any flood-prone landscape can fit. Atlantis is wealthy, so any ancient trade center can be considered. Atlantis is mysterious, so gaps in evidence become suggestive rather than limiting. This is how a myth becomes a map trap. The map does not merely reveal the theory, it seduces the theorist. Once a red circle is drawn around a possible Atlantis, every nearby detail starts auditioning for significance. A straight line becomes a canal. A hill becomes a temple mound. A local flood becomes the great catastrophe. An old name that sounds vaguely similar becomes a linguistic clue. The theory begins to collect coincidences like shells from a beach. Spain has attracted serious attention because of its position near the Western Mediterranean and Atlantic threshold. The region around the Strait of Gibraltar naturally appeals to anyone taking the Pillars of Heracles seriously. Southern Spain also has ancient history, river systems, marshlands, and evidence of long human settlement. These are real reasons to look. But looking is not the same as finding Atlantis. The Azores attract a different kind of imagination. They rise in the Atlantic itself, volcanic and remote, as if they were the surviving peaks of something larger. For people who want Atlantis in the ocean beyond the Pillars, the Azores feel almost too convenient. Yet modern geology does not support the idea that they are remnants of a drowned continent. Their drama is volcanic, not continental. North Africa has been drawn into the debate because ancient geography was complex, because the western edges of the known world were not always neatly defined, and because flood stories and old settlements can be found across the Mediterranean world. The Caribbean appears in more adventurous theories, often because it offers islands, oceanic distance, and the seductive possibility that Plato somehow preserved knowledge of lands far beyond normal Greek awareness. But with each move farther from Plato's own cultural and geographical setting, the burden of proof grows heavier, and often the evidence grows lighter. This does not stop the multiplication. It may even encourage it. Atlantis is unusually portable. Unlike Troy, which belonged to a particular epic landscape, Atlantis has just enough ambiguity to travel. Its location is described, but not with coordinates. Its destruction is vivid, but not archaeologically attached to a known site. Its scale is grand, but difficult to verify. It belongs to the sea, and the sea touches almost everywhere. So every coast can begin to look like a candidate. That is part of the human appeal. We want myth to become visible. We want the old story to leave a physical mark we can point to and say, there, that is where it happened. A myth on a page is powerful, but a myth on a map feels almost conquered. It becomes something we can visit, photograph, claim, sell, protect, argue over. There is also a quieter desire beneath it, the hope that history is hiding something bigger than the official record allows. Atlantis promises a secret chapter, a civilization missed by the textbooks, a grandeur that slipped beneath ordinary scholarship. For some, that promise becomes intoxicating. Every rejection by archaeologists or geologists can be treated not as a correction, but as part of the drama. The missing evidence becomes evidence of how much has been lost, or ignored, or concealed. That is where the search can drift from curiosity into belief. A careful Atlantis theory must be willing to fail. It must be able to say, this resemblance is interesting, but not enough. This formation is striking, but natural. This ancient site matters, but not as Atlantis. This flood was real, but not Plato's catastrophe. Without that discipline, Atlantis becomes impossible to disprove, which also means it becomes impossible to prove. The many Atlantics teach us something important about the legend. They show that the story's power does not depend on one location. In fact, its power may grow because no location can hold it completely. Each proposed site captures one piece: the Atlantic distance, the volcanic violence, the maritime culture, the moral collapse, the drowned landscape, the lost city. But none carries the whole weight without bending under it. That may be because Atlantis was never a single recoverable place. Or it may be because the original, if there was one, has been so altered by storytelling that the map now contains only echoes. Either way, the search reveals as much about us as it does about antiquity. We scan coastlines not only for ruins, but for confirmation that the world was once stranger, older, more dramatic than the surviving evidence admits. We want the sea to give back a secret. We want Plato's old warning to have foundations, walls, and a harbor. But the map keeps resisting. The more Atlantics we create, the less certain any one of them becomes. The legend spreads out until it resembles the ocean itself, reflective, shifting, and difficult to hold. And perhaps that is why Atlantis has been placed in so many waters. Not because it is everywhere, because it has never been securely found anywhere. Chapter 12. False cities on the seafloor. Every age gets the Atlantis discovery it deserves. In older centuries, the lost island was found in classical texts, strange maps, travelers' tales, and speculative geography. In the modern age, it appears on screens, a satellite image, a sonar scan, a bathymetric model shaded in blues and grays, a video clip with ominous music, and a red arrow pointing towards something rectangular beneath the ocean. The claim arrives with a familiar thrill. Researchers may have found roads, walls, harbors, or a grid pattern that could belong to Atlantis. For a moment, the old story feels close, not metaphorical, not philosophical, physical. You can see it. That is the power of modern Atlantis claims. They offer images, and images create a special kind of confidence. A viewer may not know how seafloor data is collected, processed, corrected, or displayed, but the eye sees lines, and the mind supplies builders. The eye sees right angles, and the mind supplies a city. The eye sees repetition, and the mind supplies design. This is how false cities are born. One of the most common mistakes is treating geometric appearance as proof of human construction. The ocean floor, however, is not visually random in the way we might expect. Geological forces can create patterns that look strangely organized. Rock fractures can run in parallel lines. Volcanic formations can produce terraces. Sediment movement can create long, repeated ridges. Erosion can carve channels with edges that seem too neat to be accidental. Nature has no obligation to look natural to us. That sentence may be the most useful tool in the entire Atlantis debate. We often imagine that human-made things are straight and natural things are irregular. It is a comforting distinction, but it fails constantly. Crystals form angles. Basalt can break into columns. Mud can crack into polygons. Coastlines can create repeating curves. Underwater lava and tectonic stress can shape surfaces into forms that seem almost engineered, especially when viewed from far above. Then there is the problem of the image itself. Seafloor maps are not simply photographs taken with a giant underwater camera. Many are assembled from soundings, satellite estimates, survey tracks, interpolation, and processing choices. They are translations of measurements into visual form, and every translation can introduce artifacts. A famous kind of Atlantis claim begins with a grid-like pattern on the seabed. The pattern looks like streets. It looks planned. It looks too regular to ignore. But in many cases, these lines are not ancient roads at all. They are marks from survey paths, data stitching, or differences in resolution between mapped areas. The grid belongs not to a drowned civilization, but to the way modern instruments passed over the ocean and recorded it. That is a very strange kind of ghost. Not a ghost from antiquity, a ghost from the machine. The same thing happens with underwater roads. A long, flat stone formation appears beneath shallow water. From the right angle, it looks like pavement. It seems to lead somewhere. It has edges. It invites the imagination to place sandals on it, carts on it, processions moving toward a temple that no longer stands. Then geologists examine it more closely. The stones are natural beach rock, or fractured limestone, or a formation shaped by wave action. It may be ancient, impressive, and visually uncanny, but not necessarily built. The disappointment is real, but the correction matters. A natural formation can be beautiful without being a ruin. Supposed underwater walls follow a similar pattern. At low resolution, a ridge can become masonry. At higher resolution, masonry becomes rock. What seemed like stacked blocks may turn out to be jointed stone. What seemed like a harbor breakwater may be a reef. What seemed like a palace foundation may be a shadow made persuasive by contrast. The sea is full of almosts, almost a road, almost a wall, almost a city. Atlantis lives inside those almosts, and modern media has learned how to keep it there. A claim does not need to be proven to become profitable. It only needs to be visually intriguing and unresolved long enough to hold attention. Possible ruins found travels farther than mapping artifact identified. Ancient city beneath the waves has more oxygen than natural geological formation consistent with regional processes. One sounds like a revelation. The other sounds like a meeting no one wants to attend. But truth often arrives wearing boring clothes. That is not an insult to science. It is a reminder that reality is under no obligation to be cinematic. A real underwater archaeological discovery requires more than dramatic shape. It needs context, artifacts, datable material, signs of human activity that cannot be explained more simply by geology. A road should connect meaningful places. A wall should show construction logic. A city should leave debris, pottery, tools, anchors, worked stone, food remains, inscriptions if we are lucky, and patterns of life that make sense together. Atlantis claims often begin with form and stop before context. They show the outline, not the culture. That is why they collapse under scrutiny. A city is not merely a shape on the ground. It is a concentration of human behavior. It has waste, repair, trade, storage, ritual, damage, rebuilding, and ordinary mess. The ruins of a civilization are rarely as clean as a diagram. They are cluttered with use. False Atlantis discoveries tend to be too clean, too isolated, too dependent on one angle of vision. They look convincing in the frame chosen for them. Then the frame widens. No pottery, no settlement layers, no datable occupation, no clear tool marks, no regional pattern, no independent evidence of a matching civilization. Only a formation that becomes less human the longer it is studied. This does not mean the people who first notice such places are always dishonest. Curiosity often begins with honest surprise. Someone sees a pattern and asks what it is. That is a legitimate beginning. The trouble starts when the desired answer arrives before the evidence does. Atlantis is especially vulnerable to this because the legend has already prepared the conclusion. If a strange formation appears beneath the sea, there are many possible explanations. But if a person is already searching for Atlantis, the formation does not enter the mind neutrally. It arrives as a candidate. It is judged not by what it most likely is, but by how beautifully it could complete the story. This is why skepticism is not the enemy of wonder. Skepticism protects wonder from being wasted on the wrong thing. There is real wonder in the ocean floor, real drowned landscapes, real shipwrecks, real ancient ports, real coastlines that vanished as sea levels changed. There are still discoveries to be made, and some of them will be astonishing. But if every strange shape is forced to become Atlantis, then the actual history beneath the water becomes harder to see. The false cities teach us a discipline of looking. They ask us to separate pattern from proof, image from artifact, excitement from evidence. They remind us that the human eye is not a neutral instrument. It is hungry. It wants meaning quickly. It wants the line to be a road, the shadow to be a wall, the grid to be a city, the city to be Atlantis, and the sea, patient as ever, offers no correction until we earn it. When the famous claims fade, they rarely disappear completely. They linger in videos, forums, books, and late-night conversations, detached from the explanations that weakened them. Each one becomes another almost proof, another suggestion that the truth is still down there. Maybe that is the final trick of false Atlantis discoveries. They do not have to prove Atlantis exists. They only have to keep Atlantis from fully disappearing. A grid becomes a rumor. A ridge becomes a road. A natural pavement becomes a lost highway of an empire no one can otherwise find. And each time the claim is corrected, the legend simply moves on, as if the ocean has endless room for one more mistake. Perhaps it does, but if we are careful, those mistakes can still teach us something. They show how deeply we want the ancient world to become visible. They show how easily technology, which should clarify, can become another mirror for desire. And they show that Atlantis survives not only because of what Plato wrote, but because every generation learns to see its own tools as a doorway into the myth. The old seekers had parchment. We have sonar. The temptation is the same. Chapter 13. Why Atlantis became a modern obsession. Atlantis should have remained a footnote, a strange story inside Plato, a philosophical example, a grand old warning about power, corruption, and the danger of a civilization becoming too impressed with itself. Scholars could have argued over it quietly, as scholars do, with footnotes, cautious language, and the occasional sentence sharp enough to draw blood without raising its voice. But Atlantis did not stay there. It escaped. It left the dialogues and entered a much wider world. Occult societies, speculative histories, adventure novels, pseudo-archaeology, conspiracy culture, television documentaries, internet forums, and late-night videos promising that the truth was finally about to surface. The less Atlantis could be proven, the more flexible it became. And flexibility is one of the great survival traits of a legend. A proven Atlantis would be limited. It would have a location, a date, a culture, pottery styles, trade goods, burial habits, food remains, arguments about drainage and ceramics. It would become part of archaeology, which means it would become more real, but also smaller. Evidence has a way of trimming mythology down to human size. An unfound Atlantis can be anything. It can be the mother civilization, the source of hidden wisdom, the origin of pyramids, the remnant of a forgotten global empire, the victim of divine punishment, the proof that ancient people knew more than modern scholars admit, the lost golden age before everything went wrong, the secret that explains all other secrets. That is why Atlantis became so useful to people who wanted the past to contain a hidden master key. In the modern imagination, Atlantis often changed from Plato's morally decaying empire into something almost opposite, a radiant civilization of wisdom, advanced science, spiritual insight, or technological power. This transformation is revealing. Plato's Atlantis was not meant to be admired without caution. It was wealthy and impressive, but also corrupted. Yet modern versions often stripped away the warning and kept the glamour. The empire Plato wanted us to fear became the paradise people wanted to recover. That shift says less about the ancient world than it says about us. Modern people live with a strange contradiction. We are surrounded by technology, but we also feel haunted by loss of meaning, continuity, nature, mystery, origin. Atlantis offers a fantasy that solves several desires at once. It says there was once a civilization that possessed what we lack: It was ancient, but advanced, spiritual, but powerful, hidden, but recoverable, destroyed, but not entirely gone. It gives nostalgia a city. The 19th and 20th centuries helped turn Atlantis into a stage for these desires. As archaeology uncovered real ancient civilizations, the public imagination began to stretch. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Minoan Crete, the Maya, and other ancient cultures showed that the past was far more complex than many earlier Europeans had assumed. But where responsible archaeology worked slowly through evidence, pseudo-archaeology often rushed ahead with a more dramatic claim. Perhaps all ancient achievements came from one vanished source. Atlantis became a convenient source. Too convenient. If pyramids appeared in different parts of the world, Atlantis could be invoked. If myths of floods appeared in distant cultures, Atlantis could be invoked. If ancient engineering seemed impressive, Atlantis could be invoked. The legend became a kind of blank check written against the unknown. This pattern is not harmless. It can flatten real cultures by implying they needed help from a lost super-civilization to build, navigate, calculate, imagine, or govern. It can turn the achievements of actual peoples into evidence for a fantasy elsewhere. Instead of respecting the distinct genius of Egypt, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, the Andes, or the Aegean, Atlantis theories sometimes gather them into one grand borrowed inheritance, as if human creativity needs a single secret origin to be impressive. That is not wonder. That is impatience wearing a costume. Popular adventure also played its part. Atlantis is almost perfectly designed for storytelling. It has everything a narrative wants: a lost world, a catastrophe, forbidden knowledge, a possible map, the threat of greed, the beauty of ruins, the sea as barrier, and the promise that the past is not finished with us. No wonder novelists, filmmakers, game designers, and documentary producers return to it again and again. Atlantis gives the camera somewhere to move, down through water, across carved stone, into a chamber, toward a symbol on a wall. Whether the chamber exists is almost secondary to the feeling of approach. The story is built around descent. Intellectual, geographical, emotional. We go down into the sea, down into time, down into the suspicion that official history has missed something enormous. Conspiracy culture thrives in that descent. Once Atlantis becomes not merely lost, but hidden, every absence can be given intention. No ruins. They were covered up. No artifacts. They were removed. No agreement among experts. The experts are afraid. No geological support. The science is incomplete or controlled. The theory becomes sealed against correction. Evidence is welcome when it appears to support the claim, and dismissed when it does not. At that point, Atlantis stops being a historical question and becomes a belief system. But it would be too easy and too smug to dismiss every modern obsession with Atlantis as foolishness. The legend also survives because it speaks to something legitimate. Civilizations really do fall. Disasters really do erase places. Scholars really do revise old assumptions. The seafloor really does contain history. Ancient memory really can preserve distorted traces of real events. The problem is not curiosity. The problem is certainty arriving too early. Atlantis became a modern obsession because it lives at the emotional crossroads of discovery and loss. It allows us to imagine that the past still has one great locked door. Behind it may be proof that history is deeper than we were told, that catastrophe can erase even the mighty, and that somewhere under the surface of the ocean, of myth, of memory, there remains an answer. That is a powerful promise. It is also a dangerous one, because promises can become more important than evidence. Maybe that is why Atlantis grows stronger every time it is not found. Failure should weaken a claim. With Atlantis, failure often enlarges the aura. Each unsuccessful search makes the hidden city seem more elusive, more profound, more protected by depth and time. The absence becomes part of the legend's atmosphere. Plato gave the world a story about an empire that sank. Modern culture gave it a second sinking. Out of philosophy and into fantasy, out of caution and into longing, out of a warning about power and into a dream of power restored. And so Atlantis keeps returning. Not because the evidence has finally caught up with the legend, but because the legend has learned how to survive without it. Chapter 14, Myth, Memory, and Catastrophe. There is another way to approach Atlantis that does not begin with a map. It begins with trauma. Not trauma in the modern clinical sense, but the older human experience of disaster so large that ordinary explanation breaks under it. A flood that takes fields, houses, animals, and names. An earthquake that turns a familiar city into broken geometry. A volcano that darkens the sky and makes the ground itself seem hostile. A palace burned. A harbor ruined. A coastline changed so completely that parents can no longer show children where the old road used to be. Events like these do not always survive as records. Sometimes they survive as stories. Ancient societies lived close to forces they could not control, and they often explained those forces through gods, omens, punishments, monsters, and moral lessons. This does not mean they were foolish. It means they were human. When the world breaks, people search for meaning. A catastrophe without meaning is almost unbearable. A catastrophe with meaning can be remembered, warned about, and passed on. Atlantis may belong to that deep habit of memory, not as one perfect preserved report, but as a vessel, a container large enough to hold many old fears at once. Flood, earthquake, imperial pride, divine anger, the collapse of cities, the disappearance of power, the sea returning to claim what people thought was secure. This is why the story feels familiar even before we analyze it. Cultures across the world have preserved memories of floods and destructions, though each tradition must be understood on its own terms. Some stories may reflect real local disasters. Some may be moral tales. Some may blend seasonal flooding, ancient shoreline change, political collapse, and religious imagination. The presence of a flood story does not automatically prove a single global event. It proves something more modest and perhaps more profound. Water has often been the shape human beings give to overwhelming loss. Water erases differently than fire. Fire leaves char. Earthquakes leave broken walls. War leaves weapons, wounds, and sometimes inscriptions boasting about the damage. But water can make absence look clean. It covers the evidence. It softens the outline. It turns a place into a rumor beneath a surface that keeps moving. That quality makes the sea ideal for myth. A drowned city is not simply destroyed. It is hidden. It remains imaginable. It can be revisited in dreams, visions, maps, and claims. It is gone, but not gone in the same way as ash scattered by wind. The water preserves the possibility of return. Atlantis draws power from that possibility. If the story began as a memory of some real disaster, perhaps not one event, but several, then Plato's version may be less a window and more a prism. Through it, older light is bent into a new shape. Bronze Age collapse, volcanic eruption, coastal flooding, the decline of Minoan influence, Greek myths of older island powers, Egyptian ideas of deep time, and Plato's own political philosophy may all have entered the same chamber. What emerges is not a simple record. It is a story with pressure behind it. That pressure may be why Atlantis feels emotionally convincing even when the evidence resists a literal reading. We recognize the pattern. We have seen strong societies assume their permanence. We have watched cities build close to danger because the harbor is valuable, the soil is rich, the trade route is essential, or because people always believe the worst thing will happen later to someone else. Then later arrives. The ancient world was full of reminders that human order is temporary. Rivers changed course, earthquakes damaged temples, droughts strained kingdoms, eruptions altered skies. In such a world, myth was not merely entertainment. It was a technology of memory. It compressed danger into forms people could carry. A myth can preserve what a document cannot. The feeling of a catastrophe. It may lose the date. It may change the place. It may assign blame where geology would not. It may turn social complexity into a moral fable, but it can keep alive the central warning. This happened once. Do not think it cannot happen again. Atlantis is especially powerful because it joins natural disaster to moral failure. The island does not merely suffer bad luck. In Plato's telling, it decays inwardly before it falls outwardly. Its destruction feels like geology and judgment at the same time. That combination is ancient, but it is also psychologically sharp. When disaster strikes, survivors often ask not only how it happened, but why. Why this city? Why this people? Why now? A purely physical answer, tectonic movement, volcanic pressure, storm surge, may explain the mechanism, but not the anguish. Myth steps into that gap. It may say the city grew arrogant. The rulers forgot the gods. The people broke an order. The world corrected them. Modern readers may reject the theology, but we still understand the instinct. We too turn disasters into lessons. We speak of hubris after failed engineering. We speak of warnings ignored before floods, fires, and collapses. We look for the human decision inside the natural event, because it is easier to live with a catastrophe if it contains a message. Plato's Atlantis offers the cleanest possible message. Power without virtue cannot endure. But real memory is rarely clean. If Atlantis contains traces of actual disasters, those traces have been disciplined into philosophy. The messy suffering of real communities has been transformed into a moral architecture. That may make the story more meaningful, but it also makes it less reliable as reportage. And this is where myth and history have to be held carefully together. To say Atlantis may be myth does not mean it is worthless. To say it may contain memory does not mean it is fact. A myth can be false in its surface details and true in its understanding of human vulnerability. A memory can be rooted in real events and still become unrecognizable after centuries of retelling. A philosophical story can borrow from catastrophe without preserving a usable map. This middle ground is less dramatic than announcing Atlantis found. It is also more honest. Atlantis may be a monument not to a single lost empire, but to the way civilizations remember being afraid. Afraid of the sea, afraid of wealth, afraid of moral decline, afraid that everything built by law, art, trade, and ambition might one day prove lighter than water. That fear did not die with Plato. It is still with us whenever we look at coastlines and imagine them changed, whenever we see ruins and remember they were once neighborhoods, whenever we hear of a city under threat and realize that civilization is not a permanent condition. It is an agreement, renewed daily, between human beings and forces larger than themselves. Atlantis survives because it gives that fear a shape. A ringed city, a proud empire, a night of earthquakes and floods, a sea closing over the evidence. Whether or not such a city ever existed as described, the legend preserves a truth older than any single ruin. What is built can be lost, and what is lost can grow larger in memory than it ever was in life. Chapter 15. What the evidence allows. At this point, Atlantis has become less like a single mystery and more like a courtroom with several defendants. One is Plato. One is the memory of Bronze Age disaster. One is the sea itself, accused of hiding what history cannot explain. And around them stand all the witnesses we have already heard. Santorini, Akrotiri, Crete, the Pillars of Heracles, the Atlantic floor, the false grids, the modern obsessions, the myths that preserve catastrophe by changing its shape. The question now is not which version is most exciting. The question is what the evidence actually allows. The strictest answer is also the simplest. Atlantis, as Plato describes it, has not been found. There is no confirmed sunken Atlantic empire matching his account. No verified ruins of a vast island civilization beyond the Pillars of Heracles. No material culture. No inscriptions. No archaeological horizon. No seafloor evidence strong enough to say, here is Plato's Atlantis. That matters. A mystery does not become more likely simply because it is beautiful. Beauty can keep a question alive, but it cannot carry the burden of proof. So one serious possibility is that Atlantis was Plato's invention. Not a careless invention, not a cheap fable tossed into a dialogue for decoration, a deliberate philosophical construction. Plato needed a grand contrast, an idealized ancient Athens, disciplined and virtuous, standing against a wealthy imperial power that had lost moral balance. Atlantis served that purpose perfectly. It gave political theory a body. It gave moral decay walls, harbors, rulers, armies, and finally a catastrophic ending. In this reading, Atlantis is not a failed historical report. It is a successful warning. The problem with this view is not that it lacks sense. It makes excellent sense. Plato was fully capable of shaping stories for philosophical effect. The Atlantis account appears inside works concerned with order, nature, society, and the ideal state. Its moral pattern is almost too clear to be accidental. A powerful empire grows corrupt, challenges a better society, and is destroyed. But this explanation can also feel incomplete. Plato's Atlantis is unusually detailed. Its geography, genealogy, architecture, political organization, and catastrophe are given with a density that invites more than simple dismissal. A philosopher can invent details, of course. Skilled writers do that every day. But the texture of the account has encouraged many readers to wonder whether Plato was building with older material. That leads to the second possibility, Atlantis as distorted memory. Here, the legend may preserve echoes of real ancient disasters without describing them accurately. The eruption of Thera, the buried city of Akrotiri, the influence and decline of Minoan Crete, older Greek memories of island power, tribute, sea trade, and catastrophe. Perhaps these memories traveled, changed, and merged. Perhaps Egyptian priestly lore, Greek family tradition, and philosophical storytelling transformed them into something larger than any single event. This is attractive because it respects both sides of the puzzle. It acknowledges that the ancient Mediterranean contained real catastrophes, dramatic enough to inspire legend. It also admits that Plato's version does not match those events cleanly. Santorini is not beyond Gibraltar. Akrotiri is not an aggressive Atlantic empire. Minoan decline was not a single city sinking in one night. The dates are wrong if Plato is taken literally. But memory does not behave like a museum label. It compresses. It relocates. It moralizes. It forgets measurements and keeps fear. It loses the year and preserves the image of a world undone. So Atlantis may not be a place waiting to be excavated, but a story formed around the afterlife of disaster. Not Thera exactly, not Crete exactly, not Egypt exactly. A blend of remembered collapse and philosophical design. Then there is the third possibility, Atlantis as a hybrid from the beginning. This may be the most convincing, because it does not force the evidence to choose between fiction and fact, as if ancient storytelling worked by modern categories. Plato may have used inherited motifs, old disaster memories, geographic imagination, political anxieties, and his own moral architecture all at once. Atlantis could be invented in form, but not empty in origin. It could be unreal as a civilization, but real as a response to the kinds of catastrophes and imperial failures the ancient world understood. That may sound less satisfying than finding a city, but it is more faithful to the evidence. The evidence allows a Plato who knew exactly what he was doing. It allows a Mediterranean world haunted by older ruins and disasters. It allows myths that carried fragments of real experience through symbolic forms. It allows later readers to mistake a warning for a treasure map. What it does not allow, at least so far, is the confident claim that a vast Atlantic Atlantis has been located. And that boundary is important. Without it, every theory becomes possible, and every possibility begins to look like proof. Spain can be Atlantis. The Azores can be Atlantis. North Africa can be Atlantis. The Caribbean can be Atlantis. A seabed artifact can be Atlantis. A volcanic island can be Atlantis. A myth can be Atlantis. Eventually, the word stops identifying anything specific and becomes a magnet for whatever the seeker already believes. A careful answer must be narrower. Atlantis, as Plato described it, remains unsupported by direct evidence. Atlantis, as a philosophical warning, is strongly supported by its role in Plato's writing. Atlantis, as a distorted memory of real catastrophe, remains possible but unproven. Atlantis, as a blend of political thought and ancient disaster tradition, may best explain why the story feels both purposeful and strangely alive. That is not the answer many people want, but it is the one that leaves the mystery intact without surrendering judgment. There is a kind of honesty in saying, the legend may contain truth, but not the kind that can be pinned easily to one ruin. It may preserve the emotional truth of collapse, the political truth of corrupted power, and perhaps fragments of remembered disasters whose original names are gone. The mistake is assuming that only a literal Atlantis would matter. Plato's island has already done something most real empires fail to do. It has survived for more than 2,000 years as a warning, a temptation, a mirror, and a question. It has made generations examine the ocean, ancient texts, volcanic islands, maps, and their own hunger for hidden history. What the evidence allows is not certainty. It allows a disciplined wonder. And perhaps that is the only responsible way to approach Atlantis. Not as believers desperate to make the sea confess, and not as cynics eager to drain the story of meaning, but as investigators willing to let the past remain complicated. Because sometimes the most important ruins are not the ones we find. They are the ones a civilization invents to explain what it fears becoming. Chapter 16. The empire that sinks again and again. Atlantis has not been found, as Plato described it. That is the honest place to end the search, not with a triumphant map, not with a final red circle drawn over the ocean, not with a claim that one more scan, one more island, one more suggestive line on the seabed has solved what centuries could not. The evidence does not give us that, but Atlantis has never needed to be found in order to matter. It survives because it speaks to a fear older than archaeology, that civilization is more fragile than it feels from inside its walls. Wealth can look permanent. Power can look ordained. Harbors can fill with ships, temples with offerings, storehouses with grain, palaces with voices certain of tomorrow. Then the ground shifts, the water rises, the order that seemed natural is revealed as temporary. That is the part of Atlantis we keep recognizing. Whether Plato invented the island, reshaped older disaster memories, or blended philosophy with echoes from the Bronze Age, he gave the world an image that refuses to fade. An empire so rich it became careless, so strong it became unjust, so confident it could not imagine its own disappearance. And then it disappeared. The sea, in the end, may not be proof of Atlantis. It may be something more powerful as a symbol. It is the place where evidence can vanish, where memory can blur, where the boundary between history and imagination grows unstable. It covers wrecks, cities, coastlines, and bones. It also covers our certainty. That is why Atlantis sinks again and again. It sinks whenever a society mistakes success for virtue. It sinks whenever power forgets restraint. It sinks whenever ruins remind us that people once stood where we stand, believing their world was too large to fail. The legend endures because it is not only about a lost island. It is about the uncomfortable possibility that no civilization is as solid as it seems. So perhaps the most useful question is not, where is Atlantis? Perhaps it is, why do we keep needing it? We need it because it gives shape to the dread that history can swallow almost anything. A city, an empire, a language, a warning, even the memory of what the warning meant. And somewhere beyond the last reliable map, the sea keeps moving, not confirming the legend, not denying it, only reminding us that everything human is built close to the edge of disappearance.